The final of the three branches is the judicial branch. Because it doesn't have the variety of powers of the legislative and executive branches, many people call the judicial branch the weakest branch. Don't be fooled, however. The judicial branch plays an essential and powerful role in the U.S. government. Remember that the judicial branch interprets laws, which means it looks at existing laws and how it applies to cases, and it looks at whether or not laws follow the Constitution. The judicial branch consists of the court system, with its most important members, the judges, who interpret the law. The court system has several levels, and like the other branches, it fits the Federalist model where some of its powers belong to the state government and some of its powers belong to the federal government. In both state and federal courts, all cases begin in the lower courts. For example, if you file a lawsuit, contest a traffic ticket, or adopt a child, your case will start in the lower court. If you lose your case, you can then choose to appeal the case to a higher court. An appeal isn't simply a do-over of the court case. You have to prove that the lower court made a mistake that caused it to make the wrong ruling. The highest court in the United States is the U.S. Supreme Court. All higher courts, including the Supreme Court, will only hear appeals. You cannot start a case in the Supreme Court. Finally, as noted earlier, remember that the courts are part of the Federalist structure. There are state and federal courts, and like the other branches of government, they sometimes interact in the marble cake model of federalism. They are not entirely separate. For example, the lower court in the state of Vermont is the Vermont Superior Court. All state court cases start here. If yours is a federal case, however, the lower court you'll start in is the Federal District Court. If you end up losing your case and you have to appeal, in Vermont you go to the Vermont Supreme Court, the highest court for determining Vermont state law. At the federal level, you'll head to the Federal Appeals Court, where you'll have to prove the mistake made in the law that caused you to lose your case unjustly. What if you lose your case again, but still think a mistake was made? Do you have additional options? In both cases, your case goes next to the U.S. Supreme Court, which I'll explain in more detail in a moment. The U.S. Supreme Court will hear cases from state Supreme Courts if those cases deal with the U.S. Constitution. If your case only concerns Vermont law, you're out of luck. The Vermont Supreme Court was your last option. At the federal level, your next step after the Federal Appeals Court is the Supreme Court. This means that the Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States. Cases that reach this level usually have importance beyond their outcome for their plaintiff and defendant. They often shape U.S. law and how it is interpreted in the future by the courts. Before we discuss the Supreme Court in greater detail, there are a few other key differences between state and federal courts. First are the types of cases they'll hear. State courts hear most criminal cases, so when you're watching your favorite legal drama or cop show, the courts they end up in are most likely state courts. State courts also hear the types of cases that do not involve multiple states or other countries. For example, family law is an area of the law you're probably familiar with that is decided in state court. If a couple wants to divorce or a person wants to adopt a child, those cases go before a state court. Finally, each state has its own constitution, and the state courts hear cases about the interpretation of that state constitution. For example, if you believe that a law violates the Vermont state constitution, you would bring your case before a state court. Federal courts hear many of the same types of cases, but federal cases usually involve federal law, multiple states, or other countries. For example, if you believe a law violates the U.S. Constitution, you would take that case to the federal court. You'd start at the Federal District Court, then make your way up through the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court if necessary. If a case involves multiple states, it goes to federal court. This includes criminal cases. For example, if a person is caught selling illegal drugs, that case would go to a state court. If that person transports and sells illegal drugs in multiple states, that case would be handled in federal court and may be handled in the courts of the states involved as well. Some very serious crimes are also handled in federal, not state court. Finally, state and federal courts choose their judges in different ways. State court judges are sometimes appointed by the governor, the head of the state executive branch. Sometimes these judges serve for life. Sometimes they serve for a limited term of years. In other cases, the state judges are elected by the people. When you go to vote for the first time, your ballot will include judges to vote for. Federal judges are different. They are all appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. You'll never get to vote for a federal judge, and this power of the president is one of the many reasons why your choice in this vote is important. The most powerful and well-known of federal judges are those who serve on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, as we saw earlier, is the highest court in the U.S. The Supreme Court hears cases that concern the U.S. Constitution. In other words, it is a court that often determines whether or not a law or executive order is constitutional. The Supreme Court can decide whether or not it wants to hear a case. And hint, the Supreme Court doesn't hear most cases that file an appeal at this level. More often, the Supreme Court will choose to let the lower court's decision stand. In other words, even if you reach this level with your case, there is no guarantee that the Supreme Court will even want to hear what you have to say. Part of that is because the Supreme Court is small, considering the number of potential cases it receives. There are 9 judges who serve on the Supreme Court. These judges are called justices. The 9 justices hear cases together, and each justice issues a separate ruling. The ruling favored by the most number of justices is called the majority opinion and is the final decision. Justices who disagree will often write an essay called a dissenting opinion that explains why they think their colleagues should have decided differently. Just like all federal judges, Supreme Court justices are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Supreme Court justices serve for life, which means that the opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice is one of the most important and longest lasting choices a president can make. Because there are only 9 justices and they serve for life, every president does not get a chance to appoint a Supreme Court justice. So in conclusion, the judicial branch interprets laws. Just like we've seen in the other branches, it is part of a system of federalism that divides its powers between state and federal levels. And in its interpretation of the law, it both determines how the law impacts individual cases and whether or not new laws fit the existing laws we have in our Constitution.